you are it. You know, we've sort of been waiting for this. We've heard a lot of incredible stories, and yours is really kind of the new story coming. And she has really been what we would call baptized by fire. Some of you will remember seeing her on front page, seeing her in the nightly news. This was not by her choice. This was because of attacks on the right against her working for those in extreme poverty, even just getting the simple basic necessities like clean drinking water. You wouldn't think that anybody would get upset about that, but it's just amazing, and we were shocked by it. I wondered how you would fare. You were really calm under fire, and I think you were an inspiration to all of us and a lot of young people. So you're kind of in the middle now. You're not really young, and you know, you're not 18 anymore, but you still represent the new hope, the new wave, and really the new energy.
Janaki is the youngest presenter in this series, and perhaps because of that, she has the most to teach us. I am confident that when we are gone, Janaki will be a leader of a movement that is only getting started now in the San Joaquin Valley, though it's been moving for quite a long time with people like Vandana Shiva and others around the globe. When Fresno County Supervisor Buddy Mendez tried to demean and bully her, we've seen this now on a presidential level as well against women. Take a look at that video. You can find it. And you will see in Buddy Mendez's discourse and tone the arrogance that is Westland's water district today in industrial scale agriculture. His tone and his demeanor is exactly mirroring that. And then I want you to see a woman from South Asian descent who was raised by a single mom on a Japanese farm in San Diego with dignity and integrity just stand. And in fact, teach him something about what it means to be respectful, but to have an opinion. Prior to that, Janaki worked for the California Rural Legal Assistance Incorporated in Fresno, enforcing labor standards and environmental justice protections such as access to clean drinking water for farm worker communities in California's agricultural heartland. In the past, Janaki assisted in curriculum development for a new sustainable ag and food systems degree at UC Davis. She was in fact integral to that. A major step for the state of California in shifting paradigms of agricultural education. She has farmed and diversified in orchard crops across the state, including conducting trainings at the Refugee Entrepreneurial Agriculture Project in San Diego County with refugee women farmers. Through arts and storytelling, she works to lift up histories of small-scale diversified farmers who are growing against the odds of the environmental injustice and socioeconomic burden of the San Joaquin Valley. She is an artist, a musician, a novice plant breeder. Janaki holds a degree, a Bachelor's of Science in Agricultural Development from UC Davis, and a producer certification in ecological horticulture from the UC Santa Cruz Center for Agroecology and Sustainable Food Systems. It's an honor to have her here tonight.
Hello, good evening, everybody. Buenas noches, assalamu alaikum. My name is Janaki Jagannath. Thank you for the amazing introduction, both Paul and Dan, both people that I look up to immensely. And it's just such an honor to be here on this stage to share this space that I have been to only 2 of the other presentations here, but the scholars who have been here in this room prior are people that I've looked up to for so many years and have really paved the way for me. So it's a huge honor to hear that I'm helping to carry some sort of torch after this. As Dan said, I coordinate an organization called the Community Alliance for Agroecology. And this is a group that formed just in the past year, and that's sort of the auspices under which I'll be giving the talk this evening. However, I do want to invoke sort of the rest of my background and my personality, which is a deeply spiritual one, and I am also a musician and an artist in addition to sort of my professional life. I wanted to begin with an invocation here. I mean, we've heard from Dan O'Connell and weeks later from Dean McCannell, who spoke about his brave and extremely statistically significant results of his regression analysis of the Goldschmidt thesis. This hypothesis, this infamous hypothesis, of course, was titled "As You Sow: 3 Studies in the Social Consequences of Agribusiness." And in so many words, that hypothesis was describing essentially the impacts of farm scale on community life in the San Joaquin Valley, and determined by various levels of civic engagement, participation in the democratic process, access to education, land ownership. And this passage is, "Be not deceived, God is not mocked, for whatsoever a man soweth, that shall he also reap." My presentation today is titled "Dust to Dust," because today I come to you with a new hypothesis, that not only farm scale may be a determining factor for the way that communities work in the San Joaquin Valley, but actually that it's tied integrally to what's in these 2 jars here: soil. On the right side, I have soil that comes from the west side, from the vast west side, the incredibly intensively farmed region of the San Joaquin Valley. And on the left, I have soil that comes from a small-scale farmer in Sanger. You can see the color differences, and I'm going to pass these jars around so that you all can have a whiff. Feel free to feel the texture of them. I don't suggest eating either of them, though if you were to eat one, I would say the darker one. So although this hypothesis may seem a little bit obscure at first, I hope that by the end of this presentation, you understand a little bit more of what I'm talking about. You can advance the slide. Really, my hypothesis is that a restoration of our ecology, or a reknitting of our ecological fabric, if you will, beginning with a very microscopic life that lives beneath our feet, could be the determining factor as to whether our communities of the San Joaquin Valley thrive, grow, succeed, or blow away in the dust. And I begin here with environmental justice because, here is somebody who has kind of stepped into advocacy in the San Joaquin Valley through this framework. I give a great deal of credence and a great deal of honor to the huge advancements that have been made by the environmental justice movement. Thank you to the people who come before me who have advocated and put their lives and sacrificed a great deal to essentially codify this language. Now we have in law here at federal and state levels that environmental justice is the fair treatment and meaningful involvement of all people, regardless of race, color, national origin, or income, with respect to development, implementation, and enforcement of environmental laws, regulations, and policies. And here we have a definition that has been invoked by all of us for many, many years, because without this language in law, we wouldn't have enforcement of a lot of the outcomes that Goldschmidt was actually talking about in the 1940s. I'm not sure if you can see this very well, but for those of us who do work in public health, have seen and interacted with this map a great deal. This is the Cal Enviro Screen, which was a mapping tool that was developed by Cal EPA, and it shows essentially the outcomes of a lot of the factors that Goldschmidt was looking at, except this was created in 2014. So this is a map of where there's cumulative burden, both in terms of the socioeconomic factors as well as pollution burdens that are faced by some of our most impacted communities in the valley. And here in the middle is the bright red spot that we all live in. And this has to do with things such as pesticide exposure, location, proximity to hazardous waste facilities, groundwater contamination, as well as things like linguistic isolation, poverty, and unemployment. Looking a little bit closer at it, we can see that the communities of the San Joaquin Valley that are the most agriculturally productive ones are not coincidentally also the ones that are the most impacted by things like poverty and pollution. So in my work at California Rural Legal Assistance, and then now through the alliance that I coordinate, we work primarily with communities of farm workers that live in these tiny areas of the San Joaquin Valley that are essentially stratified from the rest of society. And these spaces are actually legally referred to as colonias in some parts of the United States, because they're places that have been legally recognized as being ones that are cut out of the democratic process and thereby are also dealing with some of the worst pollution burdens. So some of the issues that these communities deal with are a lack of access to water and sewer services, safe potable drinking water. Their housing is often built with materials that were found around, or their homes that were just kind of crafted by hand, of course without code enforcement. Personal health and disease transmission is pretty rampant due to lack of access to drinking water and insufficient services. Employment, of course, is in packing and processing primarily, and there is an acute lack of governance, and maybe this is the one that hurts the most for these small towns that don't have really any, there's no city council, these community members can't go to any local body and lobby for their own interests. They're essentially in an anarchic vestige of development of California, in which California agribusiness has essentially capitalized on these settlements of laborers. So there are many maps of this disparity, and I'm not going to harp on this because this is something that anybody in this room can find looking online. We are constantly faced with maps showing us how there is rampant oppression taking place in these small towns. However, this is not all it is. We're not just maps. It's not like we woke up in 2016 and all of a sudden we're dealing with this huge oppression that's taking place here. We have a hidden history here that has to be unraveled. And many people have seen images of the Dust Bowl, and I go back to the Dust Bowl for a reason that, like I was saying, it feels like we haven't come very far since the 1940s, since Goldschmidt released his study, because we're still trying to holler from the highest peak that agriculture has caused a lot of these problems. It's not the other way around. It's not that communities are dealing with environmental justice, from some grace of God. I mean, it's not natural to be dealing with this level of suffering. And really there is some design behind the way that our agriculture has developed here in California. So I always return to this, and for those of you who have the soil right now, you can touch the lighter color one and imagine what that soil feels like when it's suspended in the air, being carried by wind the way that it did during the Dust Bowl. And it comes from a capitalistic, profit-driven form of agriculture that really pushed an ecosystem to its limit. And I return here because communities of color have always worked the fields in California, but during Dust Bowl migration, there happened that communities from that area, extremely agriculturally intensive, the plains of the United States, moved to California looking for work. And it happened to be around the same time that agriculture in California was completely shifting from large-scale, low mechanized agriculture to orchard production to fulfill the East Coast markets. The train system was being developed, and around this same time, those residents moved into the California Central Valley and settled many of these colonias that are now our environmental justice communities of today. So that's a history that's not necessarily ever brought up, because that would mean dealing with the fact that a natural disaster combined with a mismanagement of an ecosystem led to migration. I don't think that, since that time, since the late 1920s and 1930s, when the USDA set up the division of the NRCS, the Natural Resource Conservation Service, that was meant to protect our soils. Since then, we haven't really entered into a dialogue about how to protect our soil as a way of protecting economy, human health, and communities. So this culture of pushing an agricultural system to an extreme resulted in this sort of separation of human life from the agricultural system. And as I was saying, prior to Dust Bowl migration, of course, Native communities, Mexican people here in California were already working in the field, doing stooped back labor, picking beets, doing weeding. And when that migration took place, those people who were maybe farmers, tenant farmers in the Great Plains moved to California, and with a certain amount of economic wherewithal, because of being white migrants, were able to essentially create these small towns that are dealing with some of the big issues of today. And that development stratified communities from the agricultural development of California. And though today we laud the Central Valley as being this huge and incredibly productive area of California and of the United States, we really we sort of invoke this figure that we're a $40 billion economy that's pumping out a massive amount of export commodities, and that our dairy industry is the biggest one in the United States. We still haven't dealt with the fact that this has caused the sort of poverty and degradation of human life that we're dealing with. Who here lives in a town that has packing house in it? If you live on the valley floor, everybody's hand should be up, because every town here, if you look at Greeley, Sanger, Dinuba, Del Rey, all the way down to Arvin, these are all towns that have essentially been built around the packing industry. These are towns that, by and large, have a packing house anchoring it the way a church anchors a village in most parts of the world. And that history of development hasn't been really understood or taken into account by our state government. So some of the issues that this has caused, some of maybe the most heartbreaking results of this agricultural development have really been, in my experience, related to water. And the instance that folks have been talking about related to this instance where I was, trying to talk about the outcome of a lack of access to affordable drinking water in some communities in the West Side. I was really, advocating for two communities in specific that are called Cantua Creek and El Porvenir, and these two towns are located in the West Side. And they actually receive surface water for their drinking water purposes. So they're actually sort of an outlier. The majority of towns in the California Central Valley use groundwater for their drinking water purposes. And a lot of that water is contaminated by agricultural pesticides and also runoff from agricultural chemicals. So nitrate, arsenic, coliform bacteria, DBCP, dibloropropane, 1,2,3-TCP. These are some of the actors that we're dealing with. A cocktail really of these chemicals that is causing an outcome that over 1 million people in California lack access to clean and affordable drinking water every year. And I love this image. This is an ecology of power. It's a little cartoon that I've seen in a number of places, but the way we can understand California's agricultural development is this way. We have a University of California system that has been funded federally. It's a land-grant university system that provides expertise to the industry. The industry and government are essentially working together to promote as much production as possible. And out here, we have experiment stations all across the San Joaquin Valley that are meant to sort of promote these scientific advancements of agriculture. And growers, of course, are the people that are essentially, they're kind of the lab rats for a lot of this agricultural development practice. And nowhere in here, again, are community residents or people who work in the field, and in no part of this ecology is that need really being addressed. So back to Westlands Water District. I mean, this evening wouldn't be complete if I didn't talk a little bit about the debacle with Westlands, because we've heard in the past talks here have been focused primarily on this issue of power holding in agriculture and shifting that power using sociology and using social sciences to uncover some of that concentration of power. And we always come back to Westlands because this is the caricature here, right? This is really this area of semi-privatized water, a surface water construct that has sort of set apart certain communities from being able to even vote or participate in the democratic process around that core natural resource. And then a huge number of farmers that are essentially reaping the benefits of a federally subsidized water infrastructure project. Who all was here for Dean McCannell's talk? Okay, so he talked a little bit about this document right here. This little light bedtime reading of mine is the environmental impact report from the Westlands Water District drainage feature. So he spoke a great deal about the effort to enforce reclamation law, and Dan O'Connell, of course, spoke a great deal about this as well. But it's sort of ironic now, today, I, being 27 years old, it's pretty much, it's a 27-year-old problem, basically, and it's been happening since I was being born in Mobile, Alabama. The Westlands Water District has essentially been suing the federal government because of a contamination problem across this entire region. So that contamination problem is that pretty much everybody knows we should never have been farming the west side. It's absolutely, the soil conditions are toxic with selenium, magnesium, and extremely saline as well. And because of this, after installing this artificial artery into the middle of this landmass of water, Westlands was dealing with a drainage problem, meaning that contaminated water had nowhere to go. When farmers have been irrigating that land, it just collects, and there's a lack of means to carry that contaminated water off-site, and that in and of itself is actually causing a regulatory environmental problem. So in response to that, the Westlands strategy was to sue the federal government for not providing a means of removing that contaminated water. Granted, the federal government did promise to do that, so I'm not sure who's really at fault there. But regardless, the two communities that I was mentioning earlier are Kentua Creek and El Porvenir. Here it's called Three Rocks, I guess they call it that in Westlands language. And you can see them, they're kind of centrally located. And those are the two towns that have dealt with sort of a caricature, as I was saying, of stratification. They're unable to vote or run in Westlands Water District proceedings or run on the board. Yet these communities were paying upwards of $200 a month for their water. You can advance the slide. So this is El Porvenir. You can see this, I didn't have a wide enough lens to capture it, but the town is literally right across the street here, about 50 homes. And on the right, you see this probably 8-inch irrigation pipe, and we have almond orchards surrounding the town. Just 2 miles down across the street is Kentua Creek. You can keep moving along. And the only grocery store here is this tiny little liquor store, the Halfway store. And there they have maybe some Coca-Cola, beer, Doritos, that kind of thing. And this is El Rio, or the canal that runs right by the community. The community of people who are paying $200 a month for their water get to drive by this every day or walk, as it would be, to work and see this every day. The question here is striking. Like, why would water be so expensive? Why would your water bill be so expensive when this is running clear and blue right next door? And our state government, actually, as it turns out, after a visit from the governor's office, had a similar question. Why is that the case? And it's remarkably nobody knew. This turned out to be a real mystery. You can keep going. This is what some of the homes look like there. They're trailer homes, like I was saying, this is definitely would kind of be classified as a colonia. It's a small town that deals with not only pesticide exposure from the constant aerial pesticide that's being drifted on them in the local farms, but also deals with groundwater contamination. They're getting water from that canal because they can't get it from the well because the well is too contaminated. And of course living in kind of, trailer-like homes. And this is just once again what the irrigation right across the street looks like. This is the town of El Porvenir. Actually, some of you, maybe a lot of you actually participate with the American Friends Service Committee. And this town was actually built with support from the American Friends Service Committee. And prior to that intervention, this was actually just a ramshackle tent town, actually, without any support from that nonprofit. So they actually created a park. You can see the park is pretty dry. Nobody wants to be watering the park when they're paying $200 for water that comes out of their tap. This story, I think, is sort of like I was saying, it's a caricature of what happens when power holding of land really is basically allowed to run free without a check from the government, without checks and balances from the government, and without democratic process for community residents. And this story is not new, of course. We've been hearing about folks who have studied this region prior in the speaker series. And actually, it's going to be next year, by January 15th, that a massive settlement is actually going to be signed in favor of Westlands Water District. Unfortunately, that's actually going to remove acreage limitations and ultimately return $300 million back to Westlands Water District because the federal government couldn't make good on their promise of the drainage requirements. Dan, can you bring that map up really quick? So you've heard about George Elfie Ballas, and his work to show land ownership patterns in this Westlands Water District. And I'm lucky enough thank you, Tom and Dan. I'm lucky enough in my investigation of this region that I went to his home, Sun Mountain, and scouring his records, was able to uncover this amazing map that he made before Google Maps existed. And this is a map of land ownership because of the regulation, the reclamation law that said that if you want to get federally subsidized water coming from that big blue canal you saw, you would have to have 160 acres or less and live on site. 160 contiguous acres. So you can see this checkerboard pattern was created by large landowners that essentially got around whatever small regulation that there was, poorly enforced regulation, by purchasing pieces of land in their name, in their niece and nephew's name, in their cousin's name, and so forth, and essentially creating a checkerboard pattern of their land, and by way of basically continuing to own massive amounts of acreage, far beyond 160 acres. So folks who want to have a look at this map afterward, it'll be out for you to see. So now that we've talked about all the depressing outcomes of concentrated land ownership and power, I wanted to talk to you a little bit about our vision for the future. And because we've seen that there hasn't been a proper response by the state government, that the environmental justice movement, though we're extremely proud and honor it a great deal because it's brought us this far, we still have to take our movement a step further and a step further beyond that. And I coordinate the Community Alliance for Agroecology because agroecology is essentially a movement to restore an ecology to an agrarian system that has been systematically shredded by policy and by industry. It's a school of thought that's rooted in indigenous Latin American principles of tending the earth in the right way and producing food, and it's focused in a radical decentralization of the agricultural system. The phrase food sovereignty is an idea that people, that communities should have the ability to determine what it is they're eating, the manner by which they receive it, and they should have food security that is self-determined. So it's self-determination. This is, okay, so that's fine, you can move ahead. We use that Cal screen map a lot, but I honestly find this map a little bit more interesting. This is a map of California vegetation communities. And what's that big gray blob in the middle? That's called urban and agriculture. All around it, we have plant communities that have some ecological history. However, in the middle of the state, it's just gray. We don't have any history of our ecology here, according to this map created by the state. So I see this kind of as like, I'm gonna take this out because I'm just not used to standing in one place the whole time. So, I mean, when you think about this in terms of a system, it kind of looks like a big lobotomy, doesn't it? I mean, like we have this huge, beautiful brain of California. We've put an artificial IV system, essentially, of canals, capillaries carrying our lifeblood, our water through the state. And then in the middle, we have a big cavity. It's like we lost our frontal lobe. We lost our capacity to have memory about our ecology. And this is something that, you know, this is probably what makes agroecology the craziest framework to use. And I like that. You know, I think anybody with a wild image, with a wild idea for the future is going to be called crazy for a few years, and I'm ready to face that one. But restoring ecology to this place is going to start with a radical democratization of our agricultural system by and for the people who work the land. These are just images, again, of the hydrologic zones of California, the sort of, you could say, artificial arteries of the state. So in Westland's Water District, despite all of the pollution, the contamination, the centralization of the power there, we still have farmers there in the cracks and crevices of that huge map that you saw, who are working to restore the ecology of that place, using whatever the political situation is that they're in. And this here is Jesse Sanchez, Jesus Sanchez, and Alan Sano is his partner. And they both run a farm called Sano Farms in the west side. And they're engaging in some incredible soil restoration on their land. They're not organic by any means, they're still spraying Roundup. However, they're working to essentially build their soil organic matter. Where'd the soil jars get to? Okay, great. Could you hold up the dark one? So that soil like this, that the person in the back is holding up, is the kind of soil that Jesse is working to rebuild on his land in a place that's essentially chalk and salt. He's working to grow cover crops that allow for nitrogen fixation in the soil, that restores that juicy, leafy material in the soil, and also sequesters carbon. So, you know, by global standards, is working to actually draw CO2 out of the atmosphere and put it back in the soil. This sensitivity to the land, building that soil organic matter, is essentially, it's a practice that has to be done in order to mitigate groundwater pesticide runoff and to actually improve local air quality. And it's by no means easy. I mean, he's been doing this for decades now, and he actually started doing it because of a lack of water allocations. There wasn't enough water in the west side. Farmers actually aren't receiving their water allocations. So he said, I need to start building my soil so that it holds water better. And this is a soil tester, and I mean, down like 3 or 4 feet, there was really beautiful, rich, dark soil. This is another gentleman that I work with named Jimmy Zhang. He grows lemongrass in Sanger. And he also, though he only farms maybe 10 acres, Jesse, on the other hand, is just a commodity crop producer. He grows tomatoes and cabbage and almonds. Jimmy grows diversified vegetables like eggplant, cinquab, and lemongrass, as well as his main cash crop. And his form of restoring his soil is by taking whatever the residues are of the crop, laying it back on the soil, and tilling it back in. And you can see on the left, he's growing peanuts, which are a natural fertilizer. If you grow them in the right way, they fix nitrogen, which means instead of putting synthetic nitrogen fertilizer on your soil, you can grow your own nitrogen. So he's growing peanuts on the left, and he's piling up the organic matter here, and he'll return it back to the soil. And here we have Stephen Lee, who's here with us in the room at Quaker Oaks Farm. We were lucky enough to get to go visit Quaker Oaks and brought some community residents there who were learning about small-scale growing methods. And we had a workshop later on actually about growing cover crop. And so I'm giving you these examples as people who are cultivating the sensitivity to their land, and by doing that are really working to restore their soil ecology. And of course, Paul Buxman here. Sorry, I didn't warn you that I was going to put a picture of you up here. And Dan. So both of these gentlemen are looking out over a quarter acre, if I remember correctly, on Paul's farm, where Paul was telling us about how he needs a program to assist with fallowing his land, basically not pushing it to its limit like every other farm is doing, but just to let it breathe for a second. And these practices are really the ones that are, rather than just going down your same trajectory of growing a crop for a profit, pushing your soil to its maximum limit, are instead sort of taking a step back, and of course taking an economic cut potentially, and making a few sacrifices to actually keep a long-term vision for what that soil is going to be 10, 50, 100 years down the road. So when I think about this, you can keep going. So when I think about these people, my friend Antonio here grows marigolds for the Day of the Dead, and rather than spraying fumigants, he actually grows marigolds and tills the matter back into the soil to kill nematodes. Farmers like this I see there are memory. There are last linkages in that lobotomized brain that we have to deal with to another way of functioning, a different way of interacting with the earth. And it's through farming methods like this that we get different outcomes for community residents. All of the farmers that you've seen in these photographs are people that either are providing directly space for local communities to grow, like on Stephen's space in Quaker Oaks Farm, or are providing salaried jobs or providing healthy jobs where there's a personal connection. And in addition, they're employing practices that are reversing, not just mitigating, but reversing all of those terrible outcomes that you saw in the beginning of this presentation. This is not just this is not just a state measure to mitigate pollution. These are people who are really taking a step to, in fact, reverse some of the worst impacts that community residents are facing. So to me, that's what agroecology is. Agroecology is not some complicated field of study. It's empathy. It's building empathy back into our land. And so I sort of always come back to the cycle here that was actually written by youth of some farm workers that we worked with in Tulare County. When asked, we held a youth convening with a bunch of kids that work in the field and their parents work in the field, and we asked kind of what are the things that you might want to do in terms of advocacy or petitioning to your decision makers to change some of the environmental outcomes that you deal with. And this just kind of blew me away, like when this came out. That basically they said food sovereignty, I'll use the phrase food sovereignty, though they said community control of food and water and community spaces, that in order for that to happen, these things need to be in place. Access to social services, including food aid for the hungry, subsidized lunch, SNAP programs, making use of government programs that are existing. Environmental justice, better wages for farm workers, food justice for communities of color, and mitigating pesticides around schools and homes. And changing the immigration narrative here. Unfortunately, this was far before the election, so there was a pretty ardent anti-Trump conversation. Access to higher education, and that as a kind of outside outcome of this, that there would be increased education on human rights and involvement in the democratic process. This really provides the foundation for the Community Alliance for Agroecology. This is our framework, that agroecology is not just a set of scientific standards of how to grow crops or how to mitigate pests without pesticides. It's foundationally about linking all of these pieces of environmental justice around a radical transformation of our food system. Agriculture that protects soil health and biodiversity, air quality, local access to fresh food, water quality, and land use and rural livelihood. So this framework is what gives me hope every day when I wake up in the morning and I do the work that I do. It's far less theoretical and much more rooted in the experiences that I see from small-scale farmers and farm workers every day. So this concludes my presentation, but I wanted to share a passage from The Grapes of Wrath. As I was saying, I feel that not a lot has changed since The Grapes of Wrath. And given the results of this election, this is really specifically about the role of immigrants in California in creating this agricultural system that we have today, and how those people who have been the most marginalized have always been the pioneers of agroecology. And I think now, today, and in the years to come, we need to be highlighting those communities that have really brought innovative practices to restore our ecology. Now and then a man crept on the land and cleared a piece, trying like a thief to steal a little richness from the earth. Secret gardens hidden in the weeds, a package of carrot seeds and a few turnips, planted potato skins. Crept out in the evening secretly to hoe in the stolen earth. Leave the weeds around the edge, then nobody can see what we're doing. Leave some weeds, big tall ones in the middle. Secret gardening in the evenings and water carried in a rusty can. And then one day a deputy sheriff said, "Well, what you think you're doing?" "I ain't doing no harm." "I had my eye on you. This ain't your land. You're trespassing." "The land ain't plowed, and I ain't hurting it none." "You goddamn squatters, pretty soon you'd think you owned it. You'd be sore as hell. Think you owned it. Get off now." And the little green carrot tops were kicked off, and the turnip greens trampled, and then the Jimson weed moved back in. But the cop was right. A crop raised, why, that makes ownership. Land hoed and the carrots eaten, a man might fight for land he's taken food from. Get him off quick, he'll think he owns it. He might even die fighting for the little plot amongst the Jimson weeds. Did you see his face when we kicked them turnips out? Why, he'd kill a fella as soon as he looked at him. We gotta keep these here people down or they'll take the country. They'll take the country. So this piece of The Grapes of Wrath is one that I hand lettered it actually, and a friend of mine made prints of it, and I have them in the back for folks later. So thank you very much for listening to me and for having me share this crazy-eyed vision for a people's agroecology, as I would put it. And thank you very much for hosting this series. It's been a pleasure to speak with you.
Who do you think is going to benefit? Who's it going to hurt if the Senate approves it?
Thank you.
It's a great question. I am concerned that it will have no problem passing, given the existing administration.
Yeah.
Honestly, I think a lot of us who work with water right now, especially around surface water projects and communities that will be burdened by those changes in that water governance, are really worried about the Endangered Species Act being gutted almost entirely, the Clean Water Act potentially being gutted in the next 6 to 8 months. And with those outcomes, come an array of additional hazards. We're already dealing with a water shortage here in California, so a mindless fast tracking of surface water is not something that we need right now. We need critical thought about how to address the needs of the most impacted communities who have an acute shortage of drinking water, rather than fast tracking water for agriculture. It's my honest opinion.
Yes.
That's so exciting. I love your presentation. So I wanted to ask about phytoremediation. I don't know if you've heard of it, but that's something that I used to work on in the past. And my past job, I used to work on the west side, and I did see the impacts of selenium. And the scientist that I worked for, he worked specifically on phytoremediation, but I didn't notice that this was talked about in your presentation. Have you worked with it in the past before? What are your thoughts on it?
I haven't actually, I don't know about any large-scale projects of phytoremediation happening in the west side, so I'm really amazed to hear about that. But I do know that now, let's talk specifically about the west side. With the settlement that will be passed next year, most likely, there will be, rather than 300,000 acres of the west side, which were supposed to be retired, that actually the number has been whittled down through negotiations to 100,000. And I know that the west side, Westlands is actually looking at some different ways of doing what they call ecosystem remediation, and I'm sure phytoremediation will be one of the tactics. In addition to just doing solar power, solar farming, and a bunch of other ideas. But for those who don't know, phytoremediation is the practice of planting certain crops that can remediate the soil, so removing certain harmful contaminants from the soil.
Thank you.
Cool. Thank you. Thanks, Eliana.
Yes, Paul Buxman. Janaki, we don't know the results of what happened after the Buddy Mendez thing, and we know that those people are probably still paying the same amount for the water, but is there any follow-up to that? And where else can they get water but to buy it from there? I don't think you can drill and get clean water there. But is there a follow-up to what's happened, and any other part of the story we don't know?
There is, yeah, thanks for bringing that up, Paul, because I forgot to mention that after the episode took place in March, I think. And since then, a lot happened. Actually, a month after that, the Fresno Board of Supervisors was meant to submit a letter to the Bureau of Reclamation basically asking for a handout of water, surface water. And that was probably a good idea were that to actually happen. Of course, that wasn't going to happen. So what actually did take place is that a groundwater study was completed a month later, showing that if they drill down to 1,600 feet, they could get clean water. So that's what is happening. They're still having it paid through a grant program that we secured from the state. The state is completely paying for all of this. The state is also paying for bottled drinking water to be delivered every month to those residents, and has been now for the past year and a half. And in addition to that, right at the end of last year, despite the fact that Buddy Mendez and his colleagues were really sort of showing a nasty face regarding the nonprofit organizations that have been knocking on doors in Sacramento to get state funds to support those communities, we work to essentially cobble together a bunch of different grant programs to bring resident water costs down to a normal price. People were paying around $50 to $60 for the past year. At the end of this year, those grant programs are going to run up, so people are going to be back up to paying whatever they were paying before. But the hope is that by next year, we will have a definite timeline of when the wells will be drilled and completed, test wells will be drilled, and hopefully by 2018, people will turn on their taps to clean drinking water. Thanks.
Hi, Janaki.
Hey, Deborah.
I'm Deborah. Deborah Saxton, a professor at Fresno State. And I've known Janaki for a while, and we've had some heart-to-heart talks about different things. I'm not going to share them, but I just wanted to share with you that I thought your metaphor of the lobotomy and the artificial arteries was just really genius, and I hope you can write it down somewhere and share it with other folks. Because it's just, you say you're not a theoretician, but like that is like really beautiful, practical, poetic stuff, and terrible at the same time. But I also wanted to bring up a generational thing. So a few weeks, I don't know when it was, but a couple of forums ago, there were comments about millennials not being involved, and so I'm speaking to you as a fellow millennial, but also a college professor in terms of how could I get my students involved in the work that you're doing, or how could other folks that are teachers or folks that work with youth get involved with what you're doing?
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Deborah. That's a really hard question for me, because I sometimes feel like getting into history is it's a hard way to engage people, but here in the Valley, when you have this huge disparity, of like atrocities that have taken place over the course of many, many years, that historical linkage does have to be drawn to some degree in order for people to get engaged and realize, like, I'm next in line here. This is gonna be my drinking water in 10 years, 20 years. Is going to be my children's drinking? Is there going to be water to drink in 30 years? Those questions have to be asked, and I guess I appreciate the fact that you do bring up history in the work that you do really clearly, and knitting, people's present day experience back into that historical narrative. And it doesn't always have to be dry or boring. I mean, I think that it's up to us to really think about innovative ways to do that. Community theater, art, storytelling. Those are ways to really start diving back into our history and unearthing that lost ecology. Do you have any other questions?
One more, real quick. I'll come up to the mic, but this doesn't really need a mic. Okay, you were introduced as having multifaceted interests, okay? So music and art, that fascinated me a little bit. We have a retreat, Peace Center. We do a lot of things with art and music and poetry. We've had dance, we've had musicians. Can you tell us just a little bit about those other facets, if that's okay, if you don't mind?
Sure, yeah. I'm glad you didn't ask me to sing, Paul. I was like,
You're a wonderful singer.
You are a good singer.
So I do like to sing. I write poetry. I play percussion. I used to play in a samba band, and I play samba and salsa percussion. And I love to dance, and I love to take photographs. So actually my photo project documenting some of the small-scale growers is online at allianceforagroecology.org, so you can have a look at that.
Okay, bravo.
And that my prints are for sale. They support my ongoing photo project.
Here we go.
Really liked your talk. Part of the history of the valley, the ecological history of the valley, Trudy Wisherman, who's not here tonight, several years ago helped to put on a program at COS about the Tulare Lake Basin, and one of the maps they showed in that was that all the streams that come out of the Sierra used to support a riparian oak habitat. Just forests coming out everywhere. And then the Tulare Lake itself had this huge population of indigenous peoples, probably, if not equal, maybe more than the Valley of Mexico. There are hundreds of thousands, maybe, of people lived in this valley. Mm-hmm. And so there's a direction to go with that history.
Give your name. Just for,
I did, Fred Smith.
no, you didn't.
Thank you very much. Yeah, we have a couple of amazing projects taking place in the Tulare area. The Quaker Oaks Farm was already mentioned, and the Quaker Friends Meeting House there on that incredible piece of land. In addition to Sequoia River Lands Trust, the entire land trust model really is one that has to be promoted and understood more by people who are looking to steward their land in order to make space to remember, and in the case of Quaker Oaks Farm, really literally making space for indigenous communities to continue to practice.
We have time for a few more questions. Don't be shy.
Yes, another one?
No, I did like to. No, we have another question.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, yeah, go ahead. Absolutely.
In my opinion, water is a human right, not a commodity to be sold or bought like the residents are doing. What is your opinion on that?
Well, I agree personally, and I also agree with California law that says that that water is a human right here in the state. We're the only state in the United States that has passed that law, AB 685, that says that here water is a human right, and that means not only water that is clean, but is also affordable. And to follow up on Paul's question related to the communities that we've worked with in the West Side, those two communities are actually now participating in a state process, a study to establish California's first low-income water rate assistance program, which is to, hopefully we'll have a multi-million-dollar program that allows for people who are in very low income, who are paying extremely high rates for water, to be able to close that gap and be able to afford drinking water in California. Well, if that's all, unless that's Paul getting up for another one.
No.
Okay. Well, thank you very much once again.
Thank you so much, Janaki. I think a lot of us, we've sat through the series and it has been incredible. There are a few other people coming that are related to this series. Will Scott Jr. will be coming, and that'll be a little while down the line, but his well is being drilled in about a week. We'll be able to plant for spring, and so it's very exciting to get water to some of the small farmers who are not only just doing it right, but you alluded to something, it's not just food and we're growing and there's the social part of that. And when we see people, farmers that are actually working with communities, bringing youth out and doing work for them, getting them jobs that are meaningful and that they can take food home for their families, you want to keep those kinds of guys in business. So this was a very hopeful evening for us. You also very clear, we can understand you so easily, and that was wonderful. I could see a lot of smiles out here. I think we're lifted, and this is not a subject that is easy to walk away with thinking that there's a possible future to it. But I think what you're bringing, this is a new thing, it's a whole new agroecology system that you're a part of. There are young people here tonight. I think you might actually be visiting them after this meeting's over. I know you perked a lot of interest there. So very exciting.